So we have a panel. We have Vicky Tauli-Corpuz, and we have Miriam Aboukrani. She's the chair of the UN Permanent Forum. She will be speaking in French, and we have an interpreter for her. And Dupolo. I hope I said that right. It's supposed to be French, and my French is absolutely not very good. And Claire, of course. So we are going to begin with Claire. And I thought it was Skype, but it's another technology called Zoom. So I'm going to leave it up to Laura, and she's going to coordinate this with Claire.
Okay, well, kia ora everybody. It's nice to be with you. I'm sitting here on my holiday in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm going to show you where I am so that you can see this beautiful beach scene. So it's great to be with you from the warmth going into the cold. So for those of you who don't know me, I come from Pō Iwi in Aotearoa, New Zealand. They are Tūwharetua, Ngāpuhi, Tainui and Ngāti Whakaue. And I'm also an associate professor at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in Aotearoa with respect to the Declaration, and specifically how the Declaration is being used in New Zealand courts. And I think it's an interesting topic because I think that our courts are embracing the Declaration in ways that we haven't seen so much in other jurisdictions. And it's interesting that, so compared to Canada, for example, that it is our courts rather than the legislature that is embracing the Declaration. Our executive government is less enthusiastic about the Declaration, at least in any political setting. It is said, for example, or our Attorney General has said, for example, that the Declaration would not inform or cannot inform treaty settlement negotiations. So in a context where there's less enthusiasm from the executive and also from the legislature, it is our courts that are embracing the Declaration. And I've said before, with respect to the court's references to the Declaration, that it is ultimately a very positive thing, and that will help enhance the legitimacy of the Declaration, because it will help to embed the Declaration into our legal system and our political system. But recently, in one of the more recent references to the Declaration in our courts, I have had some reason to feel a little bit more cautious about that, and to think that maybe it's not wholly a good thing, or certainly how the courts refer to the Declaration will be very important moving into the future. So there are at least 5 cases in where our Supreme Court, our very highest court, has used and referenced the Declaration. It has been particularly referenced by our current Chief Justice, who is retiring this month. So I'm a bit concerned that the references won't be as strong in the future with our Chief Justice having left. But there are 5 cases at least from our highest courts. And that has been led by Māori who have been pleading the Declaration in their cases. And so thinking about the ways in which the Declaration is being used, we will see, for example, that in Rapporteur, the more recent case, that it was used to support a generous understanding of standing. So to allow what is essentially a contemporary or modern Indigenous organisation to represent former customary owners of land. And another case, in the case called Takamore, the Declaration is being used to support the incorporation of, or maybe not incorporation, but certainly references to and reliance upon, to some extent, tikanga Māori or customary law. So that is a very important use of the Declaration. In another case, again, called the New Zealand Māori Council Freshwater case, the Declaration was used in a way to support a generous interpretation of our Treaty of Waitangi, the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. So again, important. And then in another case again, in Paki number 2, it was used in what we call Rapporteur, and not in the defining point of the case, but in reference to restitutionary remedies, that restitutionary remedies should be provided where possible, and the declaration is used to support that. So we see some use of the declaration and to support very important points for Māori, particularly I think the reference to customary law and restitutionary remedies. But we also see that it is not used as the deciding argument or the deciding reason for finding, for example, that customary law should be incorporated or should be referenced in New Zealand law. So it is not the defining point of New Zealand. In other words, if New Zealand law were not sufficient to get the Supreme Court to that point, then the declaration of itself would not be enough, but it can certainly be used to bolster other points. So it's not determinative, but that is unsurprising in the sense that formally in New Zealand law, international law cannot be determinative unless that international law has been incorporated into New Zealand legislation. So while it would be fantastic if the declaration had been used in a determinative way, it's not surprising that it hasn't been as a matter of New Zealand, domestic New Zealand law, not dissimilar to other common law jurisdictions. What is, however, thinking about ways in which the declaration is being used, there are a few problems. The key problem that is arising is that I think it is dangerous that state courts are becoming the primary decider or adjudicator of what the declaration means in the New Zealand setting. Because, of course, state courts have their legitimacy in the state. And the declaration, the substance of the declaration, thinking about a robust interpretation of self-determination, for example, does challenge state authority or state sovereignty. So it is ultimately difficult, I guess, for the state courts to come up with a particularly strong interpretation of self-determination without undermining their own authority. Now that is probably true in other jurisdictions, I would imagine, and probably true of Canada. I wouldn't want to say too much about Canada in a room of experts such as yourselves. But it is something that as we move on, I think we have to be cautious of and at least argue in our domestic courts that they should take an interpretation that takes into account the Tauli-Corpuz, sorry, excuse my French, and should also take into account the interpretations of Indigenous peoples of the declaration to try and counter that state bias in interpreting the declaration, or at least court's interpretation of it. Another point, and this is something that has been made a little bit of, but I'm not sure if it's actually as problematic as it might first appear, and that is that our Chief Justice referred to New Zealand as being a signatory in 2 cases when she referred to the declaration. And of course, states don't sign the declaration, they support it in the New Zealand, or they supported it in the General Assembly, or in New Zealand's case, in Canada's case, subsequently they had a delayed expression of support for the declaration. But writing that New Zealand is a signatory of the declaration is problematic because, or if it suggests that our Chief Justice is confused as to the international legal status of the declaration. It would undermine, I think, the legitimacy of that reference if she has got that wrong. I'm not sure, however, it makes too much of a difference in terms of the legal approach that the Chief Justice takes, that our courts take, because I don't think that there is much difference between bindingness and non-bindingness when it comes to the declaration, and that's for reasons which many academics and advocates have traversed in the past. So I probably don't need to go into those reasons there, but the distinction is probably not that great in end effect, so maybe that's not so much of a problem, other than it is certainly bad optics to have our Chief Justice refer to New Zealand being a signatory rather than just a supporter of that. Another point that I want to make about the sort of words of caution with respect to New Zealand's and New Zealand courts' judicial references to the declaration is that I am not convinced that the New Zealand courts are aware that they are just some bodies and some domestic bodies interpreting the declaration. In other words, they are only one sort of institution out of literally dozens, if not hundreds, of institutions around the globe who are authoritatively interpreting the declaration. So of course, there are potentially other courts who are interpreting the declaration at the domestic level. There are other legislatures who are interpreting and trying to put the declaration into domestic law, such as in Canada and elsewhere. And then there are obviously the whole raft of international institutions who are also interpreting the declaration. So they would include the expert mechanism, the rights of Indigenous peoples. I know you have a number of members there, the Permanent Forum, the Special Rapporteur. Greetings to Vicky, I can see you from here. And the international human rights treaty bodies, for example. So I am not sure that domestic courts really have an adequate understanding of the interpretive world in which they are interpreting the declaration, and that there is some need for consistency or at least awareness of other interpretations so that you don't have extremely different interpretations, say, of free, prior, informed consent, which is always a thorny issue, and one in which I know the expert mechanism has spoken about in their most recent report, as well as others such as Vicky and treaty bodies and so on. So I think that our domestic, when we have any domestic court referring to the declaration and using the declaration, that it's important that we as advocates make them aware that they're in a larger world of interpretation on the declaration. So, and that they're participating in what we might call a transnational dialogue, and that they try and be somewhat consistent in their interpretations, or at least quite explicitly aware of that. So I guess that's where I will leave it. I know that we are short on time and a little bit delayed. I can't hear anybody at the moment. I'm going to try and move to my phone so that I can hear questions or comments, and maybe someone can also write them in here. But it's lovely to be with you, albeit from here in Aotearoa, and share with you those comments about how the New Zealand courts are referring to the declaration, and then some of the issues that I can see coming out of that. But yes, thank you.
Thank you. That's a really important development to understand how the courts are using the declaration and the references to it, and really appreciate and thanks to Claire for bringing us an update on developments there. I will begin with Vicky Tauli-Corpuz. Many of you know her in her previous role as a chair of the UN Permanent Forum, I believe, for 5 years. She is now the expert, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and an extremely busy lady. But one of the things that I'm hoping that it's been clarified that she, in her own country, could not return for weeks and months because she was put on some form of terrorist list. Can you imagine that? I can't. It's not Vicky, period, but here he is. So please, Vicky, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and I'd like to first pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land we are standing on, and of course to all my colleagues who are here and all of you who have taken the time to come here. Well, basically I'm going to show a lot of pictures, but I'll just want to reiterate some of the points that Daly has shared in terms of the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So my mandate is to report on the overall situation of Indigenous peoples in selected countries which I visit, or whether officially or not, and to address specific cases of violations of the rights of Indigenous peoples through communications with governments and others. I conduct thematic studies where I choose topics that I think are relevant for Indigenous peoples and present these studies to the General Assembly. And of course, I look at some good practices, including new laws, government programs, or other arrangements that governments have with Indigenous peoples. But I also look at the good practices of Indigenous peoples themselves, no? Not just because there's not really a lot that you can say about good practices from the side of governments. So it was Daly has shown, this is Rodolfo Stavenhagen, who was the first rapporteur. As some of you may know, the rapporteurship was approved in a resolution by the Commission on Human Rights in 2001, and Rodolfo Stavenhagen was the first rapporteur, and the first country he visited was my country, the Philippines. So and I helped him in that visit. Jim Anaya, Professor Jim Anaya is the second one, and Daly has mentioned about the work that he has done in terms of interpreting the declaration, no, and how it's going to be used by the mandate. And then this, all the rapporteurs, there are 57 rapporteurs. We are called the special procedures mandate holders, and we are independent experts. We are independent from government and from the UN, and this is the majority of the rapporteurs who meet every year in Geneva. Okay, so the instruments that we use, of course, are the UN Declaration, the ILO Convention 169, all other relevant conventions and instruments, as well as regional human rights instruments, like, for instance, the OAS Declaration. And for us to be able to monitor the situation of human rights, we do country visits, and as of today, because the UN only funds 2 country visits per year. These are the official visits where we get invited by the government. And so together with the previous rapporteurs, we were able to visit 41 country visits in 29 countries. No, so some visits that were done by Stavenhagen, for instance, were visited by Jim, and I also visited some of the countries that Jim had visited to do a follow-up on the reports that they have done. As you can see, the countries least visited, the regions least visited are Asia and Africa. No, and up to now, I haven't visited any Asian country yet. No. Then when we do a visit, we do an end of mission report that I present before the government, and of course the country report, which will be presented to the Human Rights Council. And then I have thematic reports, which are which I will mention next on what were these. No, the communications. This is the one that we do on a very, on a very frequent basis, which is basically to call to the state's attention to allegations of human rights violations. No, and I think for last year, I made 49 communications to different governments on various issues. No, so the desired impact is, of course, to stop the violations, because sometimes we do it when we anticipate that there's going to be a violation, to investigate the case, to prevent future violations from happening, and also to call on the government to provide redress or reparations, to those who were victims of violations. And as you may know, criminalization of Indigenous peoples is something that's happening on a very frequent basis, and that's one of the areas that I continue to look into. Of course, I myself have been a victim of that, but I will tell you later what's the update on it. No. So we do thematic reports, and for the 2018 reports, I did a report on criminalization, which looked into what are the various forms of indigenous peoples being criminalized, how are these being addressed, what protection measures are made available, are these adequate or not. And my finding is that many of the protection measures really are very inadequate, because of course of the lack of resources, but also secondly, because many of the bodies doing protection mechanisms deal with it as an individual human rights issue, when in fact for indigenous peoples, it also is a collective rights issue. The community itself is the one criminalized, their traditional livelihoods are criminalized, and they are displaced with impunity, you know, if the government decided they are trespassing in their own lands. So these are the issues that I looked into. And the other one that I started to develop is one on governance, indigenous governance, which will be developed further this year. 2017, I did something on climate change finance, as well as the assessment of the implementation of the declaration. In 2016, I did something on conservation, how conservation is violating rights of indigenous peoples, which is seen across the board as well. And I did also a study on international trade agreements and the impacts on indigenous peoples. As I mentioned earlier, for this year, I'm going to do a report on indigenous justice, looking at how indigenous justice has been recognized or not and how it's being used. So I had an opportunity to talk with a lot of indigenous justice authorities in the countries which I visited. And the report for this will be presented before the Human Rights Council in September. And there's one other report that's on indigenous governance systems. I wanted to end my mandate. I'm ending my mandate 2020. No, I was there since 2014. So next year I will be ending it. So I thought I should end it with a positive note, because I've seen a lot of indigenous governance systems that are existing, whether they are recognized by the government or not. And the indicators of how successful these governance systems are is really good, because it can show that indigenous peoples have better security, they are able to keep away the drug cartels, the well-being of many of the indigenous peoples in those areas that they govern is much better. So I wanted to show that actually if the states, many of the states just back off and let the indigenous peoples govern themselves, the world will be in a better shape than where it is now. So that's basically the message that I think will be presented in the report, which I will present before the General Assembly in October of this year. So so just to show some pictures, you know, this is a visit I did in Guatemala, and every visit that I do, indigenous peoples perform their spiritual rituals to sort of bless the mission that I'm having, and for them to make sure that I'm in good hands while I'm visiting the country. I visit for 10 days. Sometimes it extends for two more days or 3, depending on the government. No, so this is a meeting in Guatemala that I had, and usually they come in big numbers, thousands. So the recent visit I had in Guatemala, I always have like thousands of people coming to the meetings that I hold. No? The biggest was like 5,000 people coming from different parts of the region where I visit. Yes. And then, of course, when I visit, usually I also, there are places where you cannot possibly go because of the time constraints. 10 days is a very short time. So either I have to take helicopters or small planes. And this is, that's where you can see also the territory of indigenous peoples. This is in Guatemala, in Alta Vera Pass, where there is a dam project, actually funded by the Canadian government partly, OXEC 1 and 2, dam, hydroelectric dam, and the people are protesting very strongly against it. And I will show you how these are the people who came from the different parts of Alta Vera Pass to meet with me, and here they are. And in this meeting, I met with the different victims of human rights violations. This is the mother of Bernardo Caal, who was the leader of the opposition against the dams. He is a teacher, he is a labor unionist, and he led the process to a point that he filed a petition before the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court decided to suspend the license of the dam developer. But in spite of that, he was criminalized. He was like in the media, all the companies have really smeared his reputation, and he was put in prison. So I managed to visit him in prison. Here he is, and he was hopeful that he will be released because there were 15 charges against him, all trumped up, you know. And then, but after I left, and just shortly last year, I think December, the court decided that he is guilty for stealing company property, or something like that. And so he will be in prison for 7 to 8 years. And this is the leader of the community. And so this is the nature of criminalization in many countries. And this is just emblematic of what's happening to several indigenous peoples in different parts of the world. So this is another meeting where I met with the people from the San Rafael mines. These are people, there are even mayors here. They are also against the mines that is there in the community, again with some funds also from government, from Canadian investors. And the mayor spoke up and they said that we don't agree with this because they haven't gone through the environmental impact study, etc. And so it's suspended for now, but they feel that they will be it will be released, the permit will be released very soon. But this is how indigenous peoples have expressed themselves, that even local governments themselves are really actively engaging in supporting and demanding that free, prior, informed consent should be obtained, and all the studies made, due diligence studies made, before any project is brought to their communities. And I also do unofficial visits, which means that I'm not invited officially and I cannot make a report about the visit. But I went to Guatemala 2 times, and these are the Saporsarco widows. No, these were the widows whose husbands were killed in the 1980s because their husbands were demanding their lands. And all of them were killed, 15. And so these widows filed a case against the military. And I was there for the hearing, for the trial, and after I came from there, actually the Lawyers Without Borders of Canada were very much supportive of the case. They were with the women the whole time, and just recently the court ruled that the military men who have raped them and made them sex slaves and deprived them of their lands actually are guilty. No, so this is a good development. When I was in the courts, all their heads were covered because they wouldn't show their faces because they are harassed every time they come out from the courts. No, so this is just to show where there was a Twitter about the Bernardo Caal case. You know, where the rapporteur spoke up very strongly against the government for this indictment of Caal, despite the fact that everybody would attest he is innocent. No, and this is the visit I did in Ecuador. And I'm just showing emblematic cases where the people do their spiritual rituals just like what they did, and I like this very much because they really use all the food and everything to give thanks, of course, to the Creator as well as to the ancestors, and I believe that all these rituals they do really protect me in the visits that I do, because so far nothing has happened to me despite some of the predictions that it will rain, there will be floods, etc. I always don't meet those kinds of calamities. And this is in Ecuador as well, where I went to see the area, the river where the body of an indigenous leader was killed, Jose Tendencia. They were protesting against a mining project, which is now being controlled by the Chinese. And then he was killed, tortured, and just thrown away. And this leader is showing me where it happened. and now, up to now, that happened 7 years ago. Up to now, no justice has taken place. No, and now this is the place. I also visited the prisoners. No, because I do visit because of the criminalization report that I'm doing. I went out of my way to visit prisoners, and many of these are indigenous justice authorities who have made decisions about some cases brought to their attention, but they were criminalized by the state, and now they are in prison, and I was of course appealing that these people should be released because they were practicing indigenous justice, which is recognized in Ecuadorian law. No, and this is the case, the Chevron case. Remember, Chief Edjan told me about the support that they're giving. They brought me to a toxic tour, and they are showing the soil, which is so drenched with oil that they cannot produce anything, when in fact this has been a very productive area for them. And the case, they won the case, but it was brought to the Ecuadorian Supreme Court, and they won the case. But now the case has been the tribunal in The Hague said that no, they cannot be paying 18 million, and it just reduced to 9 million to the communities. So now Chief Edjan, I know, are helping again with this case here in Canada. So, but I saw exactly what the situation is like for these people, and these are the elders and the guards, the community guards, who have formed themselves as guards to protect their territories, no. And I went to the Amazon, and I managed to see the oil rigs in the Amazon, no, where some Chinese companies are now extracting oil, and you can see that these are the oil rigs there, which is also being protested, of course, by the indigenous peoples, no, in the Amazon. And these are the Sapara and Shuar territories. Okay, this is the food of traditional food. The indigenous peoples have the right to their food sovereignty, and these are like larvae, guinea pigs, just to show you how exciting it is to go to these places, because you will eat food that you've never eaten in your life. And then you will realize that really these foods are so healthy, no. But of course, it has been shunned by the dominant populations, and so that's just the plane and the security of the UN who comes with me. And finally, I did meet with the president of Ecuador. This is President Lenin Moreno, who of course is a different president from the previous one, Korea, who really did a lot of these things, bringing in the Chinese investors, etc. But Moreno is trying to do a different tack, so he is meeting with the indigenous peoples to have dialogues with them. No, so that's that other thing that rapporteurs do. If they have, I meet with a lot of government authorities, but it was in Ecuador where I met the president himself. No. And this is also in Mexico, where our friend, many of you may know him, Adelfo Regino Montes, who used to be part of the group negotiating the declaration, and he was now appointed by President Obrador, to be the head of the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples. They replaced the previous body, which is so ineffective and useless. Now they created a stronger body. So hopefully things are going to be much better for Mexico, although I must tell you that when I did my visit there has been a lot of problems as well, no? But with him there, we talked to him, and he is inviting us very often to give advice. In fact, after I finished my report on the Mexican government, and then this new government came over, they produced the recommendations from my report, and they are distributing it to various agencies to ask them how they can implement some of these recommendations. And that's a very good thing to see, because at least they're taking the recommendations more seriously. Okay, in Guatemala, as you know, there is the CICIG, the International Commission Against Corruption, which was created by the UN and various multilateral bodies, and it managed to imprison the president, the vice president on corruption charges. So it's a very strong body because it's an independent body. So I had meetings with them because at that time they were very worried that they were going to be kicked out by the government. This is Ivan, who is the head of the CICIG. And true enough, they were kicked out, and Ivan was considered persona non grata, no, in spite of the fact that they are really. And then now there is a demonstration by the indigenous peoples and many other civil society organizations asking the government to restore back the CICIG, you know. I also meet with some of the indigenous peoples in Nicaragua. These are the Awas Tingni. Those of you who know about the Awas Tingni case, the landmark case in which indigenous peoples' rights over the lands are recognized, these are the people who are affected, and they presented to me some of the big barriers that they face in terms of their lands being restored by the government, no? And in Colombia, where I also met in Colombia, the indigenous justice issue in Colombia and indigenous governance is a very, very relevant issue because the government does recognize indigenous territories. And in fact, one indigenous territory, this territory of these people, Eleanor Salabata, for you who know her, they have really been very autonomous. They have a resguardo, and in fact they are very distinct in the sense that they managed to kick out the evangelicals who went to convert them, and even some of their people who became converts of the Jehovah's Witnesses. No? And I asked them, how did you do it? And they said that they filed a case at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, of course, because they were also, a case was filed against them as well, and the Supreme Court said that they do have the right to remove the religions that are contradicting their cultural and and spiritual traditions, no? So there are very good cases that you can see here in terms of justice as well as in terms of governance. And okay, I'll just move because this is the Standing Rock. That's Chief Dave Archambault. I did a visit to the U.S. and after the visit, that was there were several results in terms of the pipelines being suspended, and these were some of the fracking areas. Now I'll end with some of the good practices that I have identified, and some gains that I think have been achieved are that the communications and country visits results in actions taken by governments and other multilateral bodies. So, for instance, there's a case of Mario Luna, who was a Yucatan leader against the GMOs in the Yucatan area. He was imprisoned for several years, but through the communications that I constantly made, finally he was released. No, so he came to visit me when I did my visit in Mexico. There's also a project of the EU funded by which is called Water Towers in the forest of Kenya, and I protested. I wrote a letter to the EU, and there were several letters that are constantly made, and finally they canceled the whole project. And of course the whole issue of the Sepor Sarco and the list of alleged terrorists in the Philippines. And I just this was one of the Brazilian decisions to stop the construction of a mega project in Sierra. No, and they cited my report as one of the cases. And this is the High Commissioner who denounced our inclusion in the terrorist list. And there was a huge campaign, and that is one lesson that I've learned, that if there is such a case, we really need to launch a massive, sustained global campaign to get the government to change their positions. Even the local government, my own city, made a resolution saying that she cannot be included in that list, no? So finally, after all these resolutions from the local up to the global, my name was removed from the list, and last week, the 600 names were all removed from the list, no? So this is just to show that it does make a difference if we really constantly launch campaigns. I'm thankful to the Canadians for also the Canadian Indigenous peoples who have also written letters to the Canadian government to have a say over this. So this is just to give you a snapshot of what I do in my mandate, and there are still very many things that can be done, but really, and I'm ending my term, so we have to think of who should be the next rapporteur. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that talk and really demonstrating how important these human rights are that you protect through your mandate, Vicky. And I know we're running behind here, but we are going to hear from the chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Dr. Miriam Wallet-Med Aboubakrine, who is an amazing person. She is from Mali, and she's a member of the Tin Hinan, a women's association working for the defense, promotion, and development of Indigenous peoples in Africa. And she's here today. She is a new mother, and still she dedicates her life to this work, just like Brenda Gunn, who is also a new mother. So I think as mothers, these rights become even more important to us. So without further ado, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Merci. Merci Céleste. Je voudrais d'abord commencer par reconnaître le territoire qui accueille la rencontre d'aujourd'hui.
Thank you very much, Celeste. First of all, I wanted to recognize the territory who is welcoming this conference today.
Et je voudrais aussi remercier les aînés qui ont ouvert cette discussion.
And I also want to thank all the elders who helped us open this discussion.
Ainsi que les organisateurs Céleste, Laura, Hélène.
As well as all the organizers, Celeste, Laura, Helen.
Qui étaient derrière leurs ordinateurs à faire en sorte que tout se passe bien pour que nous soyons aujourd'hui à l'Université du Manitoba.
They spent considerable time behind their computers trying to organize everything so that everything would be great and would be here today at the University of Manitoba.
À Winnipeg.
In Winnipeg.
Oui, merci. Donc, moi, j'ai une tâche qui est assez élevée parce que j'ai été précédée par des oratrices très éloquentes.
So I have one task here, and it's going to be very difficult because I was preceded by two very eloquent speakers.
La spéciale rapporteuse et Madame Dali Sambodoro.
So the special rapporteur and Ms. Dali Sobodoro.
Et ma tâche est doublement un défi parce que en plus ce sont des personnes qui ont contribué à la rédaction de la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones.
And on top of it, it's more difficult because these are two people who actually contributed to the writing of the Declaration of the United Nations on the right of Indigenous people.
Et on me demande de parler de la déclaration d'un point de vue santé.
And I was asked to speak about the declaration from the perspective of health.
Mais comme Dali le disait tantôt à notre aîné, les femmes autochtones, qu'elles soient petites ou grandes, savent relever les défis. Donc, je vais essayer de relever ces défis-là.
But as Dali said earlier, Indigenous women, whether they are short or tall, are always up to the task. So I'm going to do my best here.
Donc, pour aborder cette question, je vais essayer de définir la santé.
So to start off, I'm going to try to define health.
Et d'un point de vue autochtone, bien sûr.
With an indigenous perspective.
Et aborder le cadre légal pour le droit à la santé.
And then I will be speaking about the legal framework for the right to health.
Afin d'en donner une lecture d'un point de vue autochtone.
So that I can give an interpretation of it from the indigenous perspective.
Avant de terminer par des recommandations ou des pistes, je vais aussi faire un certain bilan de ce qui a été réalisé grâce au plaidoyer des peuples autochtones pour la santé.
and then I will provide some recommendation as well as basically a synthesis of all the information, everything that has been done by Indigenous people in regard to health.
Donc, pour essayer de définir la santé autochtone, je vais partir de la définition de l'Organisation mondiale de la santé.
So in order to define what Indigenous health is, I'm going to start by the definition that was provided by the World Health Organization,
qui dit que la santé est un état de bien-être physique, psychique et social.
which states that health is a state of psychological, physical, and social well-being.
Mais tantôt, quand la spéciale rapporteuse avait fait sa présentation, on a vu qu'il y avait une dimension qui n'était pas ressortie dans la définition de l'OMS.
But when the special rapporteur did her talk, she also talked about a dimension that was not reported in the definition of the WHO,
Qui est la dimension spirituelle de la santé
which is the spiritual dimension of health.
et qui est pour nous le centre de la définition même de la santé en tant que peuple autochtone.
And for us, Indigenous people, it is at the center of the definition of health.
Et au-delà de cette dimension spirituelle, la définition de la santé en tant que telle va différer d'une communauté autochtone à une autre.
Apart from the spiritual dimension that we just spoke about, it is important to note that the definition of health is going to be different between various indigenous communities.
Elle est dépendante des déterminants, bien sûr, et ces déterminants n'ont pas la même lecture.
It depends on various determinants, and each of these determinants is actually read in a different manner depending on the community.
Par exemple, quand on va parler de l'environnement comme déterminant de la santé, il ne va pas avoir la même connotation chez l'Inuit qui est à Iqaluit ou les Touaregs qui est à Tombouctou.
For example, if we speak about the environment as a determinant, it is not going to mean the same for an Inuit community and a Tuareg community.
Certes, Dali Sombodoro nous avait mentionné, par exemple, que les Inuits, par exemple, font face aujourd'hui à certains défis comme la sécurité, qui devient un thème de plus en plus important.
For example, Dali spoke earlier about something that the Inuit have mentioned, which is, for example, the security aspect.
Mais chez nous aussi, à Tombouctou, on a ce même défi de la sécurité, mais sous une autre dimension.
In Timbuktu, we also have this issue of security, but it means something else.
Donc, c'est un leurre de penser qu'on peut avoir une lecture globale de la question de santé des peuples autochtones.
So it is an illusion to think that we can define indigenous health the same wherever you go.
Maintenant, je voudrais parler du droit à la santé. Donc, essayer de donner une définition, parce que c'est important de partir des concepts aussi. Si nous entendons sur les concepts, tout le reste va être... au moins, on va être sur le même pied d'égalité dans l'analyse que nous apportons aux différentes questions.
So now I want to speak about the right to health, and I want to give a definition of what it is, because it is important to agree on definitions so that we can basically level the playing field when we're talking about things and be on the same wavelength.
Selon les recueils des traités des Nations Unies, c'est le droit qu'a toute personne de jouir du meilleur état de santé physique et mentale qu'elle soit capable d'atteindre.
So based on the treaty book of the United Nations, the right to health is a right that every person has to enjoy the best state of physical and mental health that this person can attain.
Mais qu'est-ce que cela évoque réellement ou qu'est-ce que cela veut dire réellement?
But what does this mean in reality?
Pour moi, je vais partir d'anecdotes pour essayer de plus éclairer cette notion-là.
I'm going to share with you some stories to try to shed some light on this notion.
Ou plutôt de pouvoir vous toucher, j'espère, avec cette notion.
And in fact, I hope that I will be able to touch your heart by describing this notion.
Souvent, quand je pars à New York dans le cadre de mon mandat en tant que présidente de l'instance permanente,
Very often, when I make a speech in New York, in my capacity as president of the Permanent Forum,
Quand je prends l'avion pour aller à New York.
when I take the airplane to go to New York,
À l'aéroport d'Ottawa, parce que je pars d'Ottawa le plus souvent,
at the airport in Ottawa, because this is where I usually leave from,
j'ai l'habitude de prendre mon vol qui est tôt, en même temps que qu'il y a les vols de First Air qui va à Iqaluit.
I usually take my flight very early in the morning when there is the first flight to Iqaluit.
Et j'ai l'habitude de rencontrer des Inuits
So I'm used to meeting Inuits,
qui sont venus se faire soigner à Ottawa.
Inuits that have come to Ottawa to get health care.
Et je ne peux pas être insensible à cela et je pose des questions. Je vais vers eux parce que pour moi, certes, moi, je ne suis pas facilement identifiable comme autochtone, mais un Inuit, quand je le vois ou quand je l'entends parler, je ne comprends pas l'Inuktitut, mais j'arrive à les reconnaître.
So I usually go and talk to these people. I'm not necessarily recognizable as an Aboriginal, but I do recognize Inuit people as Aboriginal. And even though I do not speak Inuktitut, I do go and talk to them.
Like, I don't have indigenous face. Indigenous peoples can't come to me, but I can recognize. I have like Indian face, Indian from Asia or over. Oui. Donc, à propos de ça, j'ai rencontré une maman une fois avec son bébé et je lui ai dit, qu'est-ce que tu es venue faire à Ottawa?
Once I met a woman, she was with her baby, and I asked her, what did you come to Ottawa for?
C'est un nouveau-né, il doit avoir une dizaine de jours, pas plus là.
The baby was a newborn, maybe 10 days old.
Et elle m'a dit, je suis venue à Ottawa pour accoucher parce que j'avais une grossesse à haut risque.
And she told me, I came to Ottawa to give birth because I was considered a dangerous pregnancy.
Et elle était toute seule, elle n'était pas accompagnée d'aucune personne de sa famille.
She was alone, she was not accompanied by anyone from her family.
Alors pour moi, c'est ça le droit à la santé, c'est de pouvoir avoir accès aux services de santé là où on est.
So this is it for me. The right to health means accessing health services where you are.
Et si on va dans un autre contexte, par exemple au Mali,
If we go to another context now, like for example Mali,
une autre anecdote où je reçois beaucoup de photos de personnes atteintes de cancer,
I receive a lot of pictures of people who have cancer,
mais qui ne peuvent pas avoir les soins, même pas les soins diagnostiques, même savoir quel type de tumeur ils ont et quel traitement faut-il pour ce genre de tumeur.
but these people can't get any kind of health help. They can't even get diagnosis services, so they can find out what kind of tumor or cancer they have or what kind of treatment they should follow.
Donc ça aussi, pour moi, c'est de ça que parle la définition du droit à la santé pour moi.
So for me, this is what it's about, this definition of the right to health.
Donc il revient que c'est le droit de l'être humain de contrôler sa propre santé et son propre corps et le droit de ne pas être soumis sans son consentement à un traitement.
So for me, it goes back to this, the right of any human being to control their own health and their own body, as well as the right to not be subjected without their consent to treatment.
Mais aussi le droit d'accès à un système de protection de la santé qui garantisse à chacun sur un même pied d'égalité de jouir du meilleur état de santé possible.
But it is also about the right to access a system that protects health and guarantees to each and everyone on an even footing the possibility to enjoy the best state of health possible.
Donc, pour évaluer le droit à la santé, de deux anecdotes que j'ai données, il y a la disponibilité, l'accessibilité, qu'elle soit physique ou bien monétaire, donc des soins de santé abordables.
So in the two stories that I just shared with you, if we want to assess this right, we will be talking about the availability and the accessibility of healthcare,
And acceptability
as well as the acceptability
et la qualité aussi.
and the quality as well.
Maintenant, si nous allons vers le cadre légal pour le droit à la santé, que je ne vais pas détailler d'ailleurs,
Now, if we go toward the legal framework of the right to health, which I'm not going to go into details about,
il y a beaucoup d'instruments internationaux et régionaux en faveur du droit à la santé.
there are a lot of international and regional instruments that deal with this right to health.
Pour n'en citer que quelques-uns, on a déjà la constitution de l'Organisation mondiale de la santé de 1946.
Just to name a few, we have first the Constitution of the WHO, which dates back to 1946.
Et l'instrument qui est à la genèse même des différents droits que nous citons ou des différents autres instruments, qui est la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme, qu'on oublie souvent.
There's also the one that is the basis for many other instruments that we use, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Et il y a la Déclaration d'Alma-Ata de 1978.
There's the Declaration of Alma-Ata from 1978.
Le Pacte mondial sur les droits économiques, sociaux et culturels.
The International Charter on Economic Rights, Social Rights and Cultural Rights.
La charte sociale européenne de 1961.
The European Social Charter of 1961.
La charte africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples.
The African Charter of Rights of Individuals and People.
Et la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones.
As well as the Declaration of the United Nations on the Rights of Indigenous People.
Alors, je vois qu'il me reste juste 2 minutes. Et
I see I only have 2 minutes left.
Je vais passer rapidement à quelques recommandations qu'on pourrait utiliser pour améliorer les droits à la santé des peuples autochtones. Et puis, dans la phase questions-réponses, je pourrais avoir l'opportunité de revenir sur les autres aspects que je n'ai pas eu l'occasion d'aborder.
So I'm going to go straight into some of the recommendations that I have in terms of helping with the right to health for Indigenous people. And then if there are any other topics, I might be able to speak about them during the question period that we have after.
Surtout de l'étude sur la tuberculose que j'ai réalisée pendant la dernière année et qui sera présentée à la 18e session de l'instance permanente.
In particular, I'll be able to talk about the study that I did on tuberculosis that will be presented to the 18th session of the permanent forum.
Donc, si on veut que le droit à la santé des peuples autochtones avance, il faudrait assurer la participation pleine et effective des peuples autochtones à la formulation, la mise en œuvre, le suivi et l'évaluation des politiques et des programmes de santé.
So in order to ensure the right of indigenous population to health, one of the things we need to do is to ensure the full and effective participation of indigenous people to the formulation, the implementation, the follow-up, and the assessment of health policies and programs.
Il faudrait aussi sécuriser et augmenter les ressources pour les services de santé interculturels dans les communautés autochtones.
We also must secure and increase the resources for services of intercultural services of health in the various indigenous populations.
Il faudrait établir des modèles novateurs interculturels qui incluent également la santé des femmes et des filles autochtones.
We must establish innovating models that are intercultural and also take into account the healthcare for women.
Il faudrait aussi considérer la particularité des peuples autochtones en zone urbaine et des personnes vivant dans les régions transfrontalières dans la conception et la fourniture des services de santé.
We must also consider the situation of indigenous people who live in urban settings, as well as those who are in border areas during the conception and the supply of health services.
Il y a beaucoup d'expériences de réussite des programmes de santé interculturelle. Donc, il faudrait que ces programmes soient assez largement partagés.
Intercultural health programs have had a lot of success, so they should be more widely distributed.
Il faudrait aussi soutenir les processus de légitimation de la communauté pour les médecins traditionnels et ancestraux.
We also must support the legitimization process for traditional caregivers and elder caregiver.
Et puis ça me rappelle justement l'introduction de Dali qui disait que le contexte, que les droits des peuples autochtones, c'est quelque part une façon de pouvoir intégrer le contexte culturel des peuples autochtones dans les systèmes traditionnels ou modernes qui sont là.
As Dali was saying, it is important to incorporate the cultural model of indigenous people into the various systems that are put in place.
That is the rights of indigenous peoples. En fait. Organiser des conférences, des séminaires, et à ce titre, je remercie tous les organisateurs ici pour qu'il y ait des échanges sur les questions, y compris les questions de santé autochtone.
And we must also organize conferences and forums, and I want to thank, by the way, the organizer of this present forum, places where we can exchange on the issues of health for indigenous people.
Et je termine par le point que je trouve le plus important. On a beaucoup d'instruments.
And I want to finish here by talking about one of the things that I think is the most important. We have a lot of tools.
On a beaucoup d'expériences qui ont marché. On a en fait, les instruments sont les instruments légaux.
We have a lot of experiments that have worked, and we also have a lot of legal instruments.
On a beaucoup de promesses, que ce soit des États ou des organisations internationales.
We have a lot of promises, whether it's from the various states or international organizations.
Mais le défi pour nous, en tant que peuple autochtone, c'est de pouvoir ne pas être piégé par tous ces instruments, savoir les lire.
And the challenge for us indigenous people is to find ourselves not trapped by those various instruments. We must learn how to read them.
Et pouvoir suivre toutes ces promesses, toutes ces organisations, toutes ces promesses, tous ces instruments légaux qui existent pour la santé des peuples autochtones, mais aussi pour tous les autres droits, parce que les droits sont interreliés.
In order for us to be able to basically use all those legal instruments, not only for health, but for every other rights, because in the end, everything is linked.
Oui, c'est comme ça seulement par des mécanismes de suivi continuel que nous pourrions garantir nos droits.
And it is only by having follow-up mechanisms in place that we can continue to ensure the respect of those rights.
Je vous remercie beaucoup. Thank you. I'm sorry to not able to do it in English. Merci Tanmert is in my language Tamasha.
Thank you.